All right, so I think we can start. Most people have joined already. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Fairwork 2022 Translation and Transcription Platform Ratings. My name is Patrick Feuerstein. I'm a researcher at the Berlin Social Science Center and part of the Fairwork Secretariat. It's my great pleasure to be moderating today's launch event here for Fairwork. Today, we are launching the 2022 Fairwork Translation and Transcription Platform Report. For this purpose, I'm more than happy to present the following three speakers who will introduce, summarize, and comment on our key findings in the next 60 minutes. Following the order of speakers, I would first like to welcome Mark Graham, professor at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford, and director of the Fairwork project, who will give us a short introduction to the Fairwork project and the report that we are launching today. Mark's input will be followed by a presentation by my colleague Tatiana Lopez, who's also part of the Fairwork Secretariat here at the Berlin Social Science Center, and who has been the lead researcher for this report. She will summarize and highlight the key results of our research in her short presentation. And last but not least, we are very honored to be joined by our external speaker today, Linda Lapini. Linda is part of SATO, the Subtitles Association, a member association of Audiovisual Translators Europe. As an expert in the field, Linda kindly agreed to discuss and contextualize our report's findings and provide feedback for our joint discussion. Welcome, Linda, and thanks again for being here. After Linda's input, we will have time for an open Q&A session where our speakers will try to answer questions and comments from the audience. But before we start, just a little housekeeping. We are very fortunate to have a varied audience here with a wide range of views, and we request all attendees to respect everybody's opinions and perspectives here in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded, and we will be posting this video on our website after the event. As the speakers will have their inputs in the next minutes, please feel free to pose any questions you have in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. We collect these questions for our Q&A session in the end. Please keep your questions as concise as possible to give everyone a chance to pose his or her question, please. All right, let's get to it. I'm more than happy to hand over to Mark for his introduction on the Fairwork project and the report that we're launching today.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today. My name is Mark Graham. I'm, as Patrick said, professor at the University of Oxford's Oxford Internet Institute and director of the Fairwork project. So today we're going to present the Fairwork 2022 Translation and Transcription Report. What this report does is it assesses and scores basic standards of fairness in working arrangements on 9 online remote translation and transcription platforms according to the 5 Fair Work principles. Those are fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management, and fair representation. The Fair Work project, it's an action research network that intends to shed light on and improve working conditions in the gig economy. The project evaluates working conditions on digital labor platforms, and then it rates individual platforms on how fair their jobs are. So the goal of the project is really to highlight better and worse practices in the platform economy, and then to show that better and fairer platform jobs are actually possible. What we'd like to do before proceeding also is just give thanks to our funder for supporting this work. The funder is the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ, and the work was commissioned by the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Internationale Zusammenarbeit, the GIZ. The report that we're releasing today on translation and transcription platforms, it's part of Fairwork's bigger research on cloud work or online freelancing, remote work. And what we mean by these terms are the types of digital labor platforms that can provide services to clients irrespective of the geographic location of workers. So translation and transcription platforms, they're currently in quite high demand. Transcribers working on platforms, they do all sorts of stuff. They help law firms transcribe court cases. They turn recordings from medical consultations into written records for documentation. They document emergency calls for local authorities. They generate minutes for business meetings, just to mention a few examples. The same goes for translation. We've got global businesses that require the localization of their websites to address customers in different markets. We've got globally distributed teams and all sorts of organizations that require internal processes, internal documents to be available in different languages. So what happens is that digital translation and transcription work platforms, they intermediate these types of services. They pool workers with different language skills from a variety of countries. And in doing so, they've created a setup that's in quite high demand from clients who are looking for a simple and often quite cheap one-stop shop for their language needs. Excuse me. The impacts on transcribers and translators, on the other hand, they're not so easy to pin down. So on the one hand, these platforms, they now open the market for language services in which demand is quite concentrated in high income countries to a wider range of workers, often in low and middle income countries. On the other hand, the emergence of digital labor platforms, it's intensifying the global competition between workers and shifting the balance of power in favor of clients. And this really has the potential to create a race to the bottom in labor standards. So everything that I've just described, it's mediated by platforms. Platforms define the terms of exchange largely unilaterally, and they often employ non-transparent algorithms to set prices or to manage work allocation. And as a result, there are really significant information asymmetries between platforms and their clients and workers. And this results in a power imbalance that ultimately affects working conditions for translators and for transcribers. So by highlighting the differences between the labor and the business practices of major translation and transcription platforms and the consequences for workers in this report, what we not only want to do is contribute to the academic discussion about platform work, but also to raise awareness amongst consumers about the conditions of platform labor and highlight the consequences for consumers of their consumption choices. So as the results of this report highlight, there are really significant differences in platforms' practices and as a result in working conditions for translators and for transcribers. So what we hope in this project is that this report will really serve as a valuable guideline for organizations, for regulators, and not least for platforms that want to help promote fair work in the platform economy. Organizational and individual consumers, they can really help to promote fairer business models and practices in the platform economy by making informed decisions about what platforms to use in their operations. So I'm really glad you're all here today to discuss these important issues, and I look forward to the next hour. I'm going to hand over to Tatiana, who will now present the key findings of the report. So thank you everyone for joining, and Tatiana, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Let me share my screen and the presentation. And let me put the presentation on presentation mode. All right. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. It's really great to see what seems to be a very global audience, as global as the workforce on the platforms that we studied and the study of which we will be presenting today. So yeah, I have the pleasure to give you a bit of an overview of the results of our translation and transcription platforms. Mark has already given a very good introduction of what these platforms are and what they do. So just to repeat this, this research is part of Fairwork's broader cloud work research, so on cloud work platforms where workers perform online services. And this research is very relevant because it is a really fast growing sector. It's not 100% known how many people work on these sectors, but we know that it is a lot. A study from 2021 found that at least 163 million workers are registered on cloud work platforms. And within the cloud work sector, as Mark mentioned, language services is also becoming more and more important as a field of work, with global businesses requiring these services such as translation, transcription. Also a sector that is growing is data annotation for AI training. So for example, for speech recognition programs, to train these programs, transcriptionists are needed who transcribe speech samples and annotate them. So in many sectors, we are needing these workers. And why is this also interesting? Because especially language services has created new job opportunities, new income opportunities for workers especially from Global South countries, from Asian countries and African countries. A study by the Online Labor Index found that more than half of the workforce in language services on online platforms comes from only 4 countries, which are India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Kenya. So on the one hand, there might be a potential with this growing sector to provide new income opportunities. On the other hand, as Mark mentioned, and as probably many of you are aware, workers on these platforms often face precarious conditions. These include low pay rates, a high share of unpaid labor. Their workers need to entertain, for example, to take unpaid qualification tests, to update their profiles, to look for jobs, to apply for jobs. All this labor time is not paid. There is exposure to physical and mental health risks. There was a big news story about one platform that we also studied some years ago, REF, where workers complained because they were exposed to, for example, 911 calls or court case reports with violent content and did not receive a trigger warning before that. And also workers face individualization that often goes along with feelings of isolation. Workers work mostly from home, they are scattered across the globe, and they have little opportunity on many platforms to communicate with each other. So it's difficult for them also to organize and to demand better working conditions with platforms. So against this background, Fairwork has developed 5 principles of fair work on cloud work platforms and rate platforms against these 5 principles. And for each principle, we have defined specific criteria that platforms need to meet to be awarded up to 2 points per principle. So for fair pay, what we request from platforms is evidence that there is full and timely payment of workers for all completed work in a recognized national currency. And also evidence that the vast majority of workers earn at least their local minimum wage. For fair conditions, we ask platforms for evidence that they take active measures to protect workers from overwork, underwork, and unpaid time, so unpaid labor time. This can be done, for example, by actively managing the worker supply or the allocation of work to individual workers. Also, we ask platforms for evidence that they have policies or measures in place to protect workers from work-related health and safety risks, such as, for example, the exposure to violent or explicit content. Then our third principle, fair contracts, covers specific characteristics that contracts should have. So contracts should be accessible, comprehensible, and they should not have clauses that prevent workers from seeking right to legal recourse. Something that is prevalent on cloud work platforms that we found are, for example, clauses that request workers to waive their right to class action, or that request workers to only solve conflicts via binding arbitration. So these are clauses that we would ask platforms to not include in their contracts to get a point for fair contracts. And secondly, contracts should be consistent with workers' terms of engagement on the platform. Since workers are usually classified as freelancers on these platforms, that means that then they should also have the right to determine their own working hours, to reject jobs without negative consequences. So this should all be part of the contracts. Then fourth, for management, here we need evidence that the platform has a documented process in place through which workers can appeal platform decisions. So for example, in translation and transcription, with regard to negative reviews of translation or transcriptions that workers deem unfair. So there should be documented on the website or in the contract a process where workers can appeal this, but also, for example, deactivations of their accounts. And in addition, we ask platforms for evidence of an anti-discrimination policy to mitigate the risk of discrimination against workers, either by the platform staff or by clients. And lastly, a field, a very big field is fair representation. And here we ask platforms for evidence of a dispute resolution process in which workers have the right to a freely chosen independent advocate. So one example are, for example, independent ombuds people that could represent workers in a conflict. And for the second point, we ask platforms for evidence that they publicly and formally recognize an independent collective body of workers, such as trade unions or associations of translation workers or transcriptionists, and that they also engage in collective dialogue and or collective bargaining with these associations. So as said, we scored platform against these 5 principles. And how did we do that? Which data did we take into account? So we collected data through basically 3 methods. The first is desk research. So for that, we reviewed available online policies or policies of platforms that are available online and the platform interface. We also, as a second method, conducted interviews and surveys with workers. So for each platform, we conducted 1 or 2 interviews, qualitative interviews with workers, and also for each platform, a quantitative survey with up to 60 workers. And in the survey in total, we received 401 responses from 401 workers from 88 countries. Third, we also sought the dialogue with managers, and we invited managers to provide us evidence for any internal policy or measures that the platform has in place that relate to the Fairwork principles. So with a triangulation of all these data from 3 sources, we then conducted a peer review process in which we assigned scores to each platform. In this process did not only participate the researchers who collected the data, but also researchers from the broader Fairwork network to ensure coherence and objectivity of the scores assigned. As mentioned, the scores are attributed to platforms according to a system where each platform can be awarded up to 2 points per principle. And the system works like that. For each principle, there is a first point. And the second point for each principle can only be awarded if the first point was also awarded. So I think you're all very curious already to see the results. So here are the results of our research and scoring process. These are the 9 platforms that we scored this year. Translator, TranscribeMe, Gengo, Lionbridge, Scribie, GoTranscript, Rev, SmartCut, and TransPerfect. And as you can see, there is a widespread in the scores. We have 2 platforms, Translated and TranscribeMe, that were able to score for more or at least 1 point on each of the 5 principles. And we have 3 platforms, Gengo, Lionbridge, and Scribie, that were able to score a point for at least 1 or 2 of each principle. But we also have 4 platforms who did not score a single point. It is important to note that where platforms did not score a point, it might not necessarily mean that they do not have measures or policies in place to fulfill our Fairwork criteria, but it means that we did not have enough evidence for this, so we could not award the point. What the league table also shows, though, is that the problems mentioned in the beginning, precarious working conditions, are not necessarily an inherent feature of the platform economy of online translation and transcription platforms, but their platform practices do matter, and that platforms have the power to create better or worse working conditions. Next, let me give you a bit of an overview of how the platforms scored on each principle. So for fair pay, we could award the first point to 4 platforms, Translated, TranscribeMe, Gengo, and Lionbridge. So these 4 platforms were able to evidence that they had systems in place to ensure that all workers were paid in a timely manner and for all completed work. And out of these 4 platforms, we could award the second point to 1 platform, Translated, because Translated was able to evidence also, in addition, that the vast majority of workers on the platform earn at least the local minimum wage. For fair conditions, we were able to award the first point to 3 platforms, which are Translated, TranscribeMe, and Lionbridge. So for these platforms, we found evidence that they have measures in place to manage the allocation of work and or supply of new workers to mitigate overwork and to reduce unpaid labor. So for example, Translated as a good practice matches individual translators with work or with job offers that match their specific skill set and the pay rate indicated by the translator, and sends them an email invite, and translators can just accept or reject the invite to the job. So this spares workers from having to browse through a list of posted job offers and to identify job offers that match their profile, which is obviously unpaid labor time. So for these kind of measures and practices, we awarded the first point to these 3 platforms. Out of these 3 platforms, 2 platforms were able to receive a second point because we found that they have active measures in place to mitigate work-related health risks. So for example, TranslateMe and Translated and TranscribeMe introduced clauses into their client terms and conditions that prohibit clients from uploading potentially harmful content or potentially harassing content, or in case it is content that is worth transcribing, like 911 calls or maybe court cases. I mean, somebody needs to transcribe these kind of documents, then clients need to flag the potentially sensitive content, and workers are sent a trigger warning before accepting a job. For fair contracts, we could only award points to 2 platforms, Translated and TranscribeMe, who were able to score the first point and also the second point. So these 2 platforms had contracts, that is in their case the terms and conditions or terms of service, that are accessible to workers at any time on the website and that are written in clear language, that are comprehensible, and that do not have the clauses, unfair clauses such as clauses requiring workers to waive their rights. And also they were able to evidence that the contracts are consistent with workers' terms of engagement. As said, workers are free to reject jobs and to choose their own working hours. Fair management, we were able to award 3 platforms the first point, Translated, TranscribeMe, and Scribie. These platforms were able to evidence that workers can communicate with a human platform representative effectively, and that they have this documented and effective appeal process that I mentioned earlier. And also Translated and TranscribeMe were able to evidence anti-discrimination policies. Translated actually introduced this in dialogue with Fairwork in this round of ratings. Lastly, fair representation. Yeah, this seems to be a field where platforms really need to do better, where lots of work needs to be done to grant workers their right to collective representation, because unfortunately, we were not able to award a single point to any platform. So no platform could evidence that they have a dispute resolution process in which workers have access to an independent advocate. And no platform was able to evidence that they officially recognize and engage in collective dialogue or bargaining with a collective worker association. So here we would really encourage all platforms to do better. And we think that an important development that might also pave the way for platforms to engage more with collective worker associations is the new guideline published by the EU Commission that now grants individual self-employed workers or solo self-employed workers also the possibility to engage in collective bargaining, which wasn't possible before due to antitrust laws. Maybe Linda will tell a bit more about that after I'm done with my presentation. This is just to say that with our ratings, we do not just want to produce research findings, we also want to create impact. We want to contribute to actively improving working conditions for workers, and that is why we also actively engage in dialogue with platform managements and consult with them and advise them on changes that they can implement to make work fairer on their platforms. And out of this process of dialogue, 2 platforms, Translated and TranscribeMe, implemented various changes in this round of ratings to make work fairer. Just to pick out 2 examples, for example, Translated updated the FAQ section and included more information for workers about their quality assessment framework to make the rating criteria transparent, and also an appeal process explaining in detail to translators how they can appeal negative ratings that they deem unfair. And as mentioned, also included a non-discrimination clause in their terms and conditions. TranscribeMe also made various changes. Among others, they, for example, introduced penalties for uploading potentially harmful or abusive or harassing content for clients into their clients' TNC. So coming to the end of the presentation, we also want to address the topic of this webinar. What can consumers do? How can you take socially responsible and informed decisions when contracting services of online translation and transcription platforms? And with Fairwork, we want consumers to use our ratings as a resource to choose platforms that provide workers better conditions. We think that especially organizational customers can really leverage their consumer power in the procurement process by, for example, introducing internal policies or guidelines that say that employees of the organization can only contract platforms, platform services from platforms that meet at least, for example, 7 of the Fairwork principles or that score best in their respective field. Similarly, banks or investors could develop guidelines to only invest in platforms that score, for example, at least 7 points or in the better scored platforms. And for consumers, for organizations who are prepared to make this kind of commitment, we also want to make this known to platforms. And to this end, we have introduced the Fairwork Pledge, which is a public commitment that organizations can join by signing the Fairwork Pledge to signal to platforms that there's a lot of organizations out there that do not only care about price, but also about conditions for workers. And so far, more than 40 organizations have already signed the Fairwork Pledge. Here is just a selection of those who have. And organizations can join the pledge in 2 levels or with 2 levels of engagement. The first one is to become a Fairwork supporter. So to become a Fairwork supporter, all that your organization needs to do is to endorse the Fairwork principles with a public statement on the website or in social media. And also to make Fairwork resources such as our ratings or, for example, a handout that we have produced and that I will introduce now, make those available to staff and members to enable them to take informed and responsible decisions when using platforms. The second level, Fairwork partners, they go one step beyond that. They do all of the above, but also they integrate Fairwork principles into their organizational practices and activities. For example, by developing such internal guidelines that I just mentioned to only contract the services of better scoring platforms in the Fairwork ratings. One organization that has done that, for example, is the Berlin Social Science Center. They have created an extra section in the internal procurement formula form where now employees that want to use platforms need to justify in a little text box why they chose a specific platform in relation to the Fairwork ratings. Yeah, if you are interested now, we invite you all who are watching today to go talk to your colleagues, to your management, and to convince your organization to join the Fairwork Pledge. And if you want to do so, you can do it easily on our website at fair.work/pledge. You can find a form where you can sign up. At this point, we cannot have individual consumers join the Fairwork Pledge. This will be possible in the future. Right now, this is an offer for organizations. And lastly, I also just wanted to introduce to you this handout that we have created for the translation and transcription platform ratings. There's also the longer report, which is 40 pages, which is available now on our website. But for those who don't have time to read the whole report, but who just want really a summary of our ratings and how they can use them, we have produced this handout, which is also available now on our website. And where you can really see at one glance all platforms and the services they offer and how they scored, and a bit of explanation about what Fairwork is. So if you just need like a very short information for your colleagues or managements about what are the Fairwork ratings and how to use them, this is a resource that you could probably share. Yeah, that's it. That was the overview of our research and our ratings. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions later, and first to a comment from Linda.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tatiana. Before handing over to Linda, just a short reminder for the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A box to pose all your questions on the chat. The questions can be seen by all the attendants. And there's also the option to upvote or downvote questions to indicate your interest. But now I'm more than happy to hand over to Linda for her comments on the report and the wider context of our research. Linda, really looking forward to your comment.
Thank you, Patrick. So yeah, my name is Linda Lapini. I'm a translator and a subtitler, and I'm part of the committee of SATO, the Subtitlers Association, which is a member of AVT, the European Federation of Audiovisual Translators. And AVT as a federation brings together 22 organizations from 20 European countries. Before I start, I would like to thank Tatiana and Patrick for the opportunity to speak at this event. And also I want to thank the whole research team for their very important work, which documents problems faced by translators and transcribers on cloud work platforms. I'd like to start with a brief introduction of the association that I'm part of, just to provide some context on my perspective on the topics addressed in the report. SATO is an association based in the UK, but it has members from all over the world. And while the majority of our members are subtitlers, some also work in dubbing, voiceover, and accessibility services. And because translators tend to have multiple specialties, it's very likely that many work or have done work in text translation or transcription. And an important part of the work of translators associations is to react to negative and positive practices in our field, as well as to educate the many stakeholders that surround the profession, our fellow translators, buyers and providers of translation services that are our clients and end clients in supply chains, and the audience of our translated texts. And AVT is also in dialogue with the European institutions to try and improve existing regulation on issues such as collective bargaining, social security, and intellectual property rights. And Fairwork's report really resonates with us because it provides a benchmark for better platform work. And it does so while addressing different stakeholders. So it opens up a dialogue with platforms, and we have seen from Tatiana's presentation that they have already achieved some results in their action research. It raises awareness with consumers and provides evidence for regulators. So the report is of significance, not only for the translators that are engaged in the platforms that were studied in the report, but for all translators and language service professionals in the industry. Because the problems highlighted in the report can be found on digital platforms, but also in more traditional translation agencies that act as middlemen between customers and translators. And in this respect, you could say that translators have been gig workers well before the invention of digital platforms. I will now discuss some of the challenges faced by translators engaged in cloud work, and I don't have much time, so I'll focus on aspects related to pay, contracts, and fair representation. And my comments will be very much colored by my own experience as an audiovisual translator in the media and entertainment space. And although this is a sector that has some unique challenges, I hope that you will still be able to draw some connections between my experience and Fairwork's research. So as seen in the report, translators engaged in cloud work face poor working conditions and have limited power to negotiate better rates. And this is also true for the audiovisual translators. And in audiovisual translation, the business practices of platforms tend to favor platforms and their clients. For example, platforms have little incentives to mitigate labor oversupply, as having a large translator pool helps them fulfill large volumes of orders to cope with sudden spikes in demand associated with the many streaming services that are constantly launching in new territories. The translators then have to compete for fewer jobs once the number of orders has normalized after the launch. And onboarding new translators is also an effective way to keep rates low, as translators that have had an ongoing collaboration with a client are more likely to attempt to increase their fee. And because the applicable law of contracts is usually the one where the platform or client is registered as a company, it is very difficult to seek legal redress, and audiovisual translators lose the legal protections that they would be entitled to as authors in their countries. It is not uncommon for contracts to contain a waiver of moral rights, which in Europe are technically not transferable, as well as clauses on the transfer of economic rights, which prevent translators from earning from licensing their work for broadcast. Additionally, not all platforms follow due process by allowing translators to review changes made by the proofreader, which violates the moral right of integrity. Translators are also expected to sign NDAs that forbid them from any disclosure of any kind relating to the work undertaken, including on social media and on one's own marketing material, which limits their future prospects. These contracts intimidate translators to the point where they are hesitant to discuss work in public forums. Translators are even deterred from disclosing what projects they have worked on to professional associations, which need to know if a translator is eligible to join as a member based on proven work experience. While translators' associations are in unofficial dialogue with some platforms and some end clients, it's only in the Nordic countries where associations have the status of trade unions that collective negotiations have been possible. Until now, EU antitrust laws have prevented translators' associations from bargaining collectively and even from suggesting minimum rates to their members. And there are associations that have received or have been threatened with receiving fines for doing so. There are signs that this is starting to change. The EU Commission recently, less than 2 weeks ago, has released new guidelines exempting solo self-employed workers, including platform workers, from EU antitrust laws. And the guidelines are very recent developments, and we still need to understand what exactly they might mean for translators, but they are a step in the right direction and a great way to conclude my comment on a positive note. So I would like to thank Fairwork again and hand over the floor back to Patrick for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Linda, so much for your comments, your valuable feedback and friendly feedback on our report. As I've seen the report in the chat, we've already have a question. I think this one goes to Tatiana. The question is from Sarah Miller. Do you also read other online platforms that offer language services such as Freelancer or Fiverr? So would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Yes, actually we do. This is part of our broader cloud work research that I mentioned in the beginning. We do also produce ratings. We have produced our second set of ratings this year on broader cloud work platforms, including, I believe, Freelance or Fiverr, but I would have to double check. And we have also produced a separate report on cloud work platforms more generally that you can find on our website under fair.work/cloudwork.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. There's a follow-up question from Sarah Miller, who turns out to be a freelance translator herself. And she would like to know where she can find more information about worker associations in this sector. Maybe, Linda, this is something for you.
Sure. So I would recommend visiting Audiovisual Translators Europe website, where Sarah can find a list of all the member associations that are based in Europe. SATO's website, sato.subtitles.org.uk, also has a list of resources for translators and also points to other websites of other associations. In the UK, there's also the Society of Authors, which is a trade union, and it has a section for translators. And then there is, for all other translators, maybe they're interested in resources outside of Europe, there's the Federal International, the FIT, which is the Fédération Internationale des Traducteurs, the International Federation for Translators. And I don't remember the link, but Googling should bring up some resources.
Maybe I can just add to that. If you look at our report, the full report on translation and transcription ratings that you find on our website, there's also a section at the end on worker resources, where I think we have exactly those 4 organizations that you just mentioned, and we also provide the links to those, so no need to Google.
All right, thank you so much. There are no new questions in the chat box right now, but while we wait for more questions to arrive, I would have a question for you, Linda. As we've seen in the presentation, well, you have mentioned that in your presentation as well, but also in Tatjana's presentation, that collective organizing and collective representation is pretty tricky in this sector of the platform economy. So from your point of view, what do you think are the biggest challenges for collective representation or for collective organizing in this sector? What would you see from your experience?
Well, until now, collective negotiation hasn't really been a possibility unless you were a translator based in some of the Scandinavian countries where there is more of a culture tied to having trade unions. So in those countries, if I recall correctly, Norway and Sweden, the Translators Association, their status is the one of a union, and they have been able to do some collective negotiations with some big platforms in the audiovisual translation space. But for all the other associations, really the work so far has been more of one of campaigning, advocacy, and education, because current interpretation of competition laws really prevented associations from doing more and concretely organizing in a way that allows collective bargaining. And I briefly mentioned this in my comment. Some associations in the past have been actually threatened with fines or fined even just for publishing surveys on compensation data collected from their members. So I think for the future, what we need to do is have an understanding of what the new guidelines actually mean for us, and if solo self-employed translators actually fall under all of the definitions in the guidelines, and what's the scope for us to organize collectively in a way that is compatible with the new guidelines.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Linda. I've seen a question in the chat that was about the evidence and how we publish our evidence. There has already been a very short answer to that from our technical team, but maybe Tatjana, you can give us a little bit more information about how we usually present our ratings and how we present the evidence that we have for our scores.
Yes, sure. Of course, due to protecting our respondents from worker surveys and our interviews, we do not publish any empirical first-hand data from surveys and from interviews. What we do, though, is that in our report, we describe in more detail than I could do in this short presentation, which evidence we found for the platforms that were a score. And also we have a theme and focus where we portray this year our 2 best scoring platforms, Translated and TranscribeMe. And we introduce, in a lot of detail, their good practices. but also some challenges that still remain on these platforms. So if you're especially interested in evidence in terms of good practices, yeah, that might be a very interesting section for you in the report.
All right, thanks, Tatjana. There's still room for more questions here. So if anyone in the audience would like to pose a questions to one of our speakers, please feel free now.
Otherwise, I would have a question for Linda.
All right, go ahead.
So one topic that we touched briefly upon, but which is really an emerging topic that is impacting working conditions, especially in the translation sector, is the use of machine translation and artificial intelligence. And I'm sure those who are watching who might be from the sector are very familiar with it. So I was wondering, Linda, and I know that AVTE has launched this manifesto on machine translation. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a bit more about the challenges that are related to this, to machine translation as a new field and the use of AI, and how do you think should that be used to make work better for platforms and for translators?
Absolutely. So yeah, machine translation is a hotly debated topic in the translation field, both by academics and professionals. And there is definitely a lot of investment from platforms to integrate machine translation into their web-based tools and the tools that are used by the translators contracted in these platforms. The issue with that is first of all, when machine translation is integrated without giving the translators a choice whether they want to use that or not. And this forceful integration of technology kind of strips translators of their agency and really prevents them from making decisions about how they want to carry out their work. And usually this implementation is also accompanied by rate cuts. And unfortunately, the implementation of machine translation for audiovisual translation comes with a set of issues. The statistical models are text-based, but the material that you want to translate actually has meaning that is not just conveyed in the text, but also in the image. Also, there are a set of conventions that you have to follow when you're subtitling that relate to how the subtitles are synchronized and how the text is presented, and typographical conventions. And usually machine translation can fall a bit short. I mean, really it can depend on the platform and how good their engine is and all that. But let's say of all the applications that you could have of AI, machine translation, audiovisual translation is, at least from the perspective of professionals, is probably not the best application. And in our opinion, and this is something that is discussed also in the machine translation manifesto, there are other assistive technologies that could be implemented and that have been sort of overlooked in the hype for machine translation. For example, when it comes to the health and safety of translators, a lot of us are prone to repetitive stress injuries because we overwork. We type a lot on our keyboards, we do a lot of screen work. And for example, the implementation of voice dictation technologies that allow us to take a break from the keyboard would actually be something that helps our productivity. And this is just one example. There are other translations, for example, other technologies. For example, computer-assisted translation could actually potentially be helpful in keeping the terminology consistent when you're working, for example, on a TV series that is long-running and where terms are recurrent, and you actually need some support to help manage consistency across different materials and episodes. So yeah, this is what I have to say about machine translation. it can be implemented. It's not nice to be forced into it, and it's not nice when rates are cut without effective productivity gains.
Yeah, I think just to comment on that, I think this reflects very well the findings of our interviews and our survey, where this was the most, I think, pressing problem, that many platforms have introduced separate workflows just for post-machine editing, which is paid at a much lower rate, but it's not necessarily much faster than the actual translation, because it depends so much on the quality of the machine translation, and also on many other factors. So I think, yeah, this will definitely be a topic that will need more research also in the future to kind of get a better idea of how to design this more fairly.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have another question for Linda. So a lot of questions coming for Linda now. This is about the different jurisdictions from Kellyhausen. How do associations like yours deal with the challenges of having members based in many different jurisdictions? And Kelly elaborates on, for instance, it must be difficult to know which regulation applies to contractual relationships with platforms and clients across different countries. I can imagine this is a tricky point, right?
It is very tricky, and you never know quite which legal framework to refer to, when you're trying to advocate for better working conditions. Even, for example, if a translator wanted to challenge some of the abusive NDAs that we're forced to sign, you don't quite know. You would have to be an expert in international law or cross-border law application to be able to challenge those, because a lot of the companies and the platforms, the clients that we are contracted with, they'll be based in countries like Singapore or Delaware, and we don't necessarily have the knowledge about those legal systems. And for an association like SATO, that was initially founded as a UK-based association, but then expanded internationally, it's really about gathering the knowledge from our own members, because there can be no central committee that has oversight over each legal system in the world. So it's definitely difficult, and it's complicated due to the global nature of the industry.
Thanks. I have another question regarding job allocation on translation platforms. Maybe Tatiana, this is something for you, but maybe also Linda, you can say something about that based on your experience. The question is, were there any responses regarding automatic job allocation based on a repository of previous jobs and related feedback? Did you feel that these are beneficial as it saves workers crawling through jobs? Or isn't there also a risk that temporary dip in quality or friendliness might affect the chances to get work? Is there something that you can say about this based on your data, Tatiana?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you're raising a very important point. So I think it really depends on how these algorithms are constructed. So one thing that is really important that we found is what should definitely not weigh into these algorithms is also rejection of jobs, because as freelancers, workers should have the right to reject as many jobs as they want. So this is an aspect that we think should be taken into account. And then what we did see is that, yes, these kind of this algorithmic management of work allocation can help workers to save time, but it can also create access barriers for many other workers, because what can happen is that it creates a small subset or a pool of workers on a platform that regularly gets jobs, and then the algorithm kind of reinforces that the same workers get the job offers, and that makes it actually harder then for new workers on the platform to get jobs, because they need a chance to gather the experience and the quality scores, for example, that are needed to be allocated jobs by the algorithm. So in that sense, you are right. There are definitely mixed effects for different groups of workers, you could say, with these kind of algorithms.
Thank you. Anything you want to add to it, like Linda, from your experience? How do you deal with these systems?
Yeah, my experience with work allocation is I've seen a mix of systems that are first come, first served basis, as is described in the report, and also systems where translators receive a notification in their email or on the platform. And both have their disadvantages, let's say. Those who are the systems that are first come, first served are particularly problematic because they result in quite a lot of unpaid work, because you have to constantly refresh the page to see where jobs are uploaded, to see if there's any new work available, which means you're tethered to your computer. It's not unheard of translators setting up an alarm in the middle of the night to go and check the platform to see if there are any jobs, because jobs are uploaded in the United States and time zones are not factored in. So translators in Europe will be waking up in the night to check the platforms to see if they have found any jobs. And when it comes to algorithmic management, I think, as Tatiana has said, perhaps in their focus on efficiency, these platforms overlook some of the effects that these algorithms may have on working conditions. It can be difficult from translators that are disadvantaged by these algorithms to get a foot in. And this was true also before algorithms, I have to say, because project managers are risk averse. So once they find trusted translators, they tend to default to, to the one that they consider, to the translator they consider trustworthy. And also I have to say, there is some work that can be done perhaps to improve how translators are informed when it comes to how these algorithms function. They're not always transparent. And yeah, anecdotally, I've heard of people's accounts getting deactivated without, them being aware of the reason why or what behavior led to the deactivation. You never quite know if you're being penalized for not being active or not accepting jobs. So algorithms are fine. We're not opposed, but there needs to be transparency, and platforms need to make sure they don't focus just on efficiency, but also on fairness when it comes to the working conditions.
Great, thank you so much, Linda. There's the last question. I'm sorry for Engineer Danis. I hope that part of your question has already been answered by the other questions, so that I think Linda has mentioned some aspects that she considers most pressing for translators right now. So I would actually skip that question and take the question from Gökhan as the last question. I think it's for Tatiana. Gökhan would like to know, or he says that addressing the employment misclassification is also an important topic in the platform economy. And there are some court decisions that some platform workers actually need to be classified as employees instead of independent contractors. I guess there's no principle on employment misclassification as part of Fairwork principles. And he wants to know, are there any specific reasons for why you have not included this aspect, and whether we want to include it in the future? Maybe Tatiana, you can answer that question.
Yes, definitely. So yes, you are absolutely right. This is a very important aspect, and area where many platforms refrain from granting workers their due rights. So we do include it in our principles, not as its own principle, but in two principles that kind of relate to this question. The first one is principle 3.2, where we state that platforms or platform workers' contracts need to be consistent with their terms of engagement. So in that sense, at least workers need to have the right to reject jobs, to choose their working hours, and also to and some other points that I can't recall right now. So of course, in reality, then there may be structural forces that kind of constrain workers in the agency, for example, when it comes to working hours due to the demand and the time zones, as Linda just mentioned. But at least we demand from platforms that they behave in a way and that they structure contracts in a way that that we give workers the freedom to kind of determine some parts of their working conditions and work structure. And the second part where we touch this is actually it's also in fair contracts, where we ask platforms to not waive workers' rights to due legal recourse. So I think what many platforms do to avoid that they have to classify workers as employees is to put clauses in the contract or in the terms of service that say, so even should you be classified by some national agency as an employee, you hereby waive all rights to all benefits that would come along with it. Or you waive your right to conduct a class action to claim employee rights for yourself and your colleagues. So thereby we also we do not allow these kind of clauses in our principles, or we do not score points for contracts that have these kind of clauses. So in that sense, I would say we do have it in our principles and spirit, even though maybe not as its own point.
All right, thanks, Tatiana. I'm afraid we've reached the end of our time for this webinar. I'd really like to thank all of you for being here today and making this launch event as interesting as it was for me. In particular, of course, I'd like to thank our three speakers today. First of all, Linda, our external speaker here, thanks for being here, thanks for taking your time. But of course, also Tatiana and Mark for giving these interesting presentations on the report and your excellent input here for this webinar. Thank you so much. As a last remark, if any of the attendants have become more interested in the Fairwork pledge that Tatiana has presented, we really like to encourage you to get in contact with us and help promote fair working conditions in the platform economy by publicly pledging your support and by using the Fairwork rating as a guideline for your organization's practices. So thank you all for being here, and hopefully see you all at the next Fairwork event. Thanks a lot and have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thank you, Linda.